I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, a surprising, bizarre end to the story that's been front and center on the Jewish scene in America for 3 months. The spate of bomb threats made against Jewish centers and other Jewish institutions throughout the country. And although no bomb actually went off, there was real fear and upheaval in many Jewish communities, and both children and adults were traumatized by having to evacuate buildings for fear of their lives. Now, it's been generally assumed that the threats came from some kind of white supremacist group or groups in America, and that they signaled an eruption of latent anti-Semitism. And many in the Jewish community maintained that this eruption was Donald Trump's fault and the product of the tone he let loose during the campaign. But lo and behold, we learn that Israeli police have arrested a 19-year-old in Israel, an Israeli, and charged him with placing the threatening robo-calls to Jewish institutions throughout America. The teenager, who holds dual American citizenship, has been engaged in bomb threats for years, in Europe as well as in the United States. And one of his threats caused a Delta plane to have to make an emergency landing. It's also said that the young man suffers from a brain tumor a number of years ago, though it's not certain if that plays any role in the teen's behavior. Well, what's it all mean? That the bomb threats were not the product of hate groups in America, but were a heinous act of a very disturbed Israeli 19-year-old. For some comment, I'm most pleased to be joined on our JBS phones by Evan Bernstein, New York Regional Director of the Anti-Defamation League. Evan, thank you so much for joining us.
No, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So, Evan, the Anti-Defamation League has been crucial. It's been extraordinarily helpful in taking the lead in trying to explain to American Jewry what we should not be doing, what precautions we should be taking. And these precautions would be relevant whether the bomb threats, in fact, did come from Americans and were real, or whether they were, in some way the product of this disturbed young man in Israel. But I do want to know if I was at the ADL today, Evan, what was the mood and what was the reaction in the halls of the ADL?
For us, I think we're just glad that the suspect has been arrested, and for what has been really just an extremely disruptive, terrifying, and invisibly anti-Semitic attacks on certain communities, and it's been certainly disturbing. And we don't know his motives. We don't know. We know his background, and it does not diminish the impact of the crimes. And when somebody, selects institutions specifically because they're Jewish, it's a hate crime, and we consider it an anti-Semitic act. And clearly, being a Jew and a Zionist, it's difficult that the person is an Israeli and has dual citizenship and is a Jew. But it doesn't take away from the fact of what was how these acts were affecting the communities around the country. And I know there's a sense of relief, not only from us, but also from the communities in the United States.
Absolutely. But did you consider it to be good news that, in fact, it was not groups in America that were launching these attacks?
Well, I think it's never good news, because there's always a perpetrator of this kind of hate for whatever the motives are. We're not in his head or his heart. We don't know why he did this. Just like we don't know with Juan Thompson, who's responsible for the first bomb threat to the ADL office here in New York. The challenges for us is, I think, understanding, that these things are happening, that they're real, and that beyond the scope of the bomb threats, there's still an immense amount of hate and anti-Semitic behavior that's taking place in this country beyond the bomb threats. So for us, it's we're happy that there's been some resolution here, but clearly this is not the solution to a much larger problem. It's one piece of a larger puzzle.
I appreciate the way you caution us. And this does not mean that American Jewry shouldn't continue to be vigilant. I'm a little surprised you don't say it's good news, because up until today, the sense in the Jewish community is we were under siege in some way. Not that we knew where exactly where the threat was coming from, but there was an unease in America that this was a product of American groups. Now we know that as upsetting as the experience was, and while it does not speak at all to the desecration of Jewish cemeteries, that's real and that happened by anti-Semites here in America. The bomb threats did occupy a unique role here, a unique place in Jewish consciousness. And
No question.
my reaction was, well, I'm so sorry that it was an Israeli kid. I assumed he's very disturbed. I feel bad for him. I'm a little bit angry, although if he's disturbed, it's hard to know how to be angry at him. But one thing that occurred to me immediately was, well, isn't this nice to know? I'm sorry it's at the cost of, learning that it's an Israeli, but it's awfully nice to know that there's no concerted effort to bomb Jewish centers and Jewish institutions
there's no question.
in America.
Martin, there's no question. There's absolutely relief on that front. There's,
Right.
there's no doubt, and it brings clarity. Listen, it was a very big question mark. Not only we were constantly asking law enforcement, we were constantly communication with these communities. Everybody wanted answers. They wanted some kind of an answer, some kind of an explanation, and we were able to get prior to the arrest, the ADL was briefed on the developments, by senior leadership of the FBI, and we're clearly grateful for all the work that law enforcement did nationally in America and in Israel to do this. But and to have that answer, I think, is very cathartic, not only for us at the ADL, but also for the communities and institutions that have been affected. There's no question.
Yeah, it's perfectly
I think
said.
the challenge is we just don't want. While we're very relieved by this information, I think it's just important to not take our eye off the ball on something that's a much larger issue. And I think it's easy because this has become so sensationalized, the bomb threats, that it's important that we don't let the other acts that maybe haven't gotten the same amount of press and has gotten the same amount of publicity, that those things are can equally affect the community and have a great effect on the Jewish community, in New York and beyond.
I've always said that the Jew walks a fine line in this area. On the one hand, we don't want to be ostriches with our head in the sand and pretend that there's no anti-Semitism latent or expressed in America. On the other hand, we don't want to go around saying the sky is falling when it isn't. Evan, how long have you been with the ADL?
Just under 4 years. Okay.
If you and I spoke last year, even 2 years ago, before we even were looking into the 2016 presidential elections, and you and I were speaking about the level of anti-Semitism in America and the extent to which American Jewry should be concerned, if I were talking to you 2 years ago, what would you have said to me?
Well, it's funny you say that, because when I first started, my leadership, my volunteer leadership, we have a dual mission at the ADL: stop the defamation of the Jewish people, secure justice and fair treatment for all. And the gross majority of the leadership said we don't need to worry about the first half of the mission. We've taken care of anti-Semitism. And so I think a lot of people thought that anti-Semitism wasn't really an issue. Now, when I started in the position and got deeper into it, we had the knockout game in Brooklyn. There were clearly still incidents of hate and anti-Semitism taking place in New York and in communities. Just before the election, the amount of hate crime, the amount of physical assaults against Jews in New York was up 100%. From 2015 into 2016, so there was clearly incidents of serious incidents of anti-Semitism taking place. They just weren't necessarily creeping into, I would say, the more secular Jewish community across the United States. And I think what has happened in the last 5, 6, 7 months is we're starting to see now acts of anti-Semitism on a more regular basis that are taking place in, I would say, more the, say, Reform conservative communities, the more outlying New York 5-borough communities, and we see that in other communities as well, around the JCCs, around those kinds of synagogues, the non-Orthodox. So I think so it's starting to affect now a broader base of the Jewish population, and I think that's what's changed. It's not that it wasn't there. It's not that our office wasn't dealing with it. There was hundreds of acts of hate and anti-Semitism before the election. I think now it's going into corners of the Jewish community that haven't seen it maybe in 30 or 40 years on a consistent basis.
Very interesting. It sounds as if, Evan, if you and I spoke, you would have spoken very differently about anti-Semitism 2 years ago from the way you would speak about it now. And it sounds as if you are now much more concerned about the phenomenon than you would have been 2 years ago. Is that fair to say?
It's very fair because our numbers show, we do polling, we've done polling since the 1960s on anti-Semitism in America, and our polling shows that between 12 and 15% of America, about 30 million people at the max level, have anti-Semitic attitudes and tendencies. And so those people, we don't feel that number is growing. We don't feel that number has gotten any larger. We just feel that number now is more emboldened than they ever have been. And they're showing that on social media. They're showing that with other acts of hate. You're seeing just the rise in the number of anti-Semitic incidents and hate crimes. So it was always there. It's just somehow the coffee can lid has now been popped off. And these people now we feel are just doing more and speaking more and acting more than they have in a very, very, very long time. And that's the concern. And that lid was maybe on more 2 years ago than it is now. And that's what we're trying to do is push back on that every day.
If I wanted to see anti-Semitism in social media, is there a place to go or a way for me to see it? You know, I'm not a big social media person, Evan. I have not personally experienced or seen anti-Semitism. I'm on the air all the time. I've not received any anti-Semitic tweets or my Facebook page or letters or emails. But if I wanted to see it, is there a place we as American Jews could see it and understand what you're referring to?
Yeah, I think. Listen, unfortunately, I get a lot of these kind of trolls and these kind of hate responses. I know Jonathan Greenblatt, our CEO, does a far greater number than I do, and there's a lot of journalists. Over 2 million anti-Semitic tweets went out over the the last year to journalists that were covering these kind of things, and people were going after them. I've had tweets sent to me with my head chopped off. I've had really, really horrific things sent to me and comments made that are just very vulgar and very, very clearly anti-Semitic, and they're real issues. I think if you want to look at a certain journalist, or you want to look at when certain posts are put out, if you want to see those trolls, or go to the ADL Facebook page, and when we put out certain things, the kind of comments that are made on some of our posts are very disturbing. And it's challenging. There's clearly white supremacist sites that are out there, like the Daily Stormer and Judas Watch, that tracks people that they feel are going against white people in America. These are very difficult things, and it's very much out there, and it's growing. And the numbers are growing. The numbers don't lie, and it's a challenge for us.
Do you worry that anyone will now say something like, "Oh, you see, Jews manufacture anti-Semitism because it was an Israeli with dual citizenship, a Jewish kid"?
Listen, you always worry about that. I mean, clearly, I guess personally, the fact that I'm a Jew and a Zionist, it's tough that this is coming out of Israel and from a Jew, and it's very hard. And the fact was, you got a lot of people saying that regardless. Maybe this incident doesn't help, but before this happened, you had people that were on the far right or even potentially on the far left, both saying that these kind of things are manufactured, these kind of things aren't real. Swastikas, et cetera, are just being painted by people. And I think that's always been there. I think it's going to be very hard. It's very hard to change the hearts and minds of those people if that's where they really were already. And this kind of thing doesn't necessarily help, but I think it's the polarizing effect of our climate right now, and how polarized we are as a Jewish community, how polarized we are as a country in general, I think is difficult. And people have their thoughts and beliefs, pretty well ingrained. And one of the things we're trying to do with our work is to try to get those people thinking more in the middle and staying in the middle and being a little bit looking at things on both angles and both sides. it's difficult, but we're trying to do the best we can with it.
You're doing wonderful work. Evan, thank you so much for joining us on JBS. We will talk often and keep up the good work.
I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. The thoughts of Evan Bernstein, New York Regional Director of the Anti-Defamation League. I'm also pleased now to be joined by the man who represents American Jewry to the Jewish world at large and helps to guide Jewish life today, the Executive Vice Chairman of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, Malcolm Hoenlein. Malcolm, as always, thank you so much for joining us.
Always a pleasure.
Malcolm, we're talking about the fact that we now have learned that rather than it being a group of white supremacists in the United States who have been giving bomb threats to JCCs and Jewish institutions all over America, it was what must be a very disturbed Israeli teenager with dual citizenship, and that he was, out of his own home, sending all kinds of threats to America and to Europe, brought down a Delta plane. When you heard that the FBI and the Israeli police had identified him and the Israeli police had arrested him, what was your immediate thought and what did you feel?
Well, obviously we're relieved that the perpetrator was apprehended. It's obviously a relief that nobody was hurt in the process and that we see that it was in fact a hoax. And as you remember on this program, in earlier times I said that it doesn't take much for somebody to get a bunch of phone numbers and to be able to call and conduct the kind of threat that he did.
That's right. That's right.
But my fear is that this will diminish the heightened sense of the significance of security for institutions, and that people will say, well, you see, it was a hoax, and therefore we don't have to invest in it, when the contrary is true. We have to keep alert, and the progress that we made in terms of getting institutions and others to look at their security situation, to enhance the protective measures that they take, are very important. You saw what happened in London in the attack. We've seen it in other places. There were still the cemetery attacks, etc. I believed from the beginning that we shouldn't overreact to the threats, but they did disrupt Jewish life. They did prevent people from going to the institutions, and so obviously people are very sensitive to it, and it can be very damaging and likely to invite copycats and others who will engage in these kind of activities, knowing that it gets some notoriety and it gets the community upset. So my concerns were alleviated about the nature of the threat, but not about the incidents. And as you remember, at that time, I also said that my main concern was still anti-Semitism on the campuses. That remains the case. I am concerned about that primarily, but not to the exclusion of the taking the steps and heightening awareness in our communities. We want to prevent. We want to make sure that we never have to look back and say we didn't take the steps necessary.
Okay, by the way, what I want to understand is do you feel that the situation today, now that we know it was a hoax, do you feel in general the level of anti-Semitism today is different from what it was a year ago or 2 years ago?
There's been a steady increase in anti-Semitic incidents. That remains a fact, aside from the threats against the JCCs. It obviously, with these numbers removed from it, it is not as dramatic, but it's still significant. And of all hate crimes, attacks against Jews is still the most prominent and most numerous. So, and this is not the result of events of the last few months, of the election, et cetera. Although I do think generally tensions have been heightened in recent months, but it's something that we have seen increase over a period of time, and therefore it remains a concern.
There are people who believe the tone set by Donald Trump has unleashed a certain kind of bigotry in general and anti-Semitism in particular. What's your view of the president's role in this?
Well, for one thing, I think any accusations that he's an anti-Semite are ridiculous and counterproductive. I think that his statement to the members in his speech to Congress, the fact that he gave such prominence to it, the fact is that DHS, FBI, and other agencies under his administration have been extremely responsive, very forthcoming, devoted great deal of attention to it. There was some concern in the beginning that he didn't specify anti-Semitism, but he did make some comments about these threats, and I think it's to oversimplify, and I think it's misdirected to say that it's attributable to him or to the election. I do think that the election did unleash forces on the extreme left and on the extreme right, which are of concern and will remain of concern. But I think that we have to credit the president for what he does right, as much as people criticize when he does things they don't like or doesn't go far enough by their judgment. He went very far in condemning anti-Semitic attacks, and the actions speak louder what the government did and the fact that they apprehended this guy.
Okay, I want to talk to you about something else as well, so just one more question here. If it isn't Donald Trump, and I tend to agree with you, what do you account for the uptick in anti-Semitism in general? Again, setting aside now the bomb threats, you're saying to me that if you look at anti-Semitism today compared to 1 year ago, 2 years ago, there's an increase. Why do you think that's true, Malcolm?
Anti-Semites don't need an excuse. It's a cancer, it's a disease that occurs, and it's present in every society. Hatred is not rational by its very nature, so you can't say that there's a single causal factor. I do think, though, the BDS campaign and related efforts against Israel to delegitimize Israel, which were at their core anti-Semitic and remain so, did unleash some of these forces, did spread the violence on campuses and from campuses into communities. We saw associations, what they call sectionality, and all these other terms to describe what, in fact, are connections between groups that are on extreme and then become co-opted into anti-Israel, but ultimately anti-Semitic expression.
Okay.
And I think that those factors contributed.
Okay. By the way, personally, I'm just happy that there isn't some white supremacist group that is behind the bomb threats. I'm sorry for this kid, and I'm sorry we had to experience it. I'm sorry for any trauma. But on balance, for me, I'm very glad that it wasn't something indigenous to America. Look, you just came back from China. We only have 3 or 4 minutes left. Malcolm, why did you go to China, and what did you find?
I was only there for 2.5 days, so I don't need more time than that. But I can write a book about China yesterday, today, and tomorrow, as the joke goes. I went because at the invitation of leading people in China, not related to the prime minister, who actually was there, overlapping the same days, but in different cities. There is a genuine interest on their part in building ties to the American Jewish community, the Jewish community worldwide, and Israel. China is obviously a critically important country, politically, strategically, economically, in every other way. And I have to say, from my meetings, I came back really reinforced in my commitment that we build ties, build bridges to China. They are very open to it. They have very clear ideas that the society is different than I think what most of us understand it to be. And there is a genuine appreciation and more of Jews. They look with great admiration on the Jewish people and on the state of Israel. And that is not necessarily on the political level, but in the individual and business level. So that I think that we have to broaden our horizons. We build ties throughout the Middle East, and we've discussed it, our efforts in the Mediterranean Initiative, in the Asian and Arab countries, in the Muslim countries. Well, China is very important, and we're going to look to other countries as well that have expressed an interest in having ties with us and through us to others in the community and to Israel.
You know, in general, China is thought to be, by many Americans, the enemy, a very repressive government with a repressive society. It sounds to me as China moves closer to Israel, which has been dramatic, and to hear the way you speak about China and trying to build bridges, Malcolm, it sounds like we're moving into a new phase of international relations when it comes to China. Do you feel that's true?
I do feel that's true. It is a repressed society. There is a lot that has to be done domestically and in terms of democratic practices. But I have to tell you, there was more openness than I had anticipated, and I've seen in other countries. I have to say, wearing a yarmulke did not pose any threat. People admired it. People, want to ask questions and want to learn more about what it means to be Jewish. They have, as I said, connections to the Jews of Harbin. Everybody will come back with the same historical references, and of course the Jews in Shanghai that were saved during World War II.
Yes.
So I think that I'm not saying it's easy. It's never easy, but we often have to deal with countries that have limited rights. But we try to work to expand those rights and to show them new opportunities.
You travel to such interesting places, don't you, Malcolm?
Last month I was in England, Morocco, Israel, Cyprus, Egypt, and thank God I'm so glad because I don't go. We went to some of these countries for a few hours only, so it's not a vacation trip. It's
right.
To produce, and there are such great opportunities today. Everybody talks about the problems and the complications and limitations. I'm telling you, there are new horizons. There are great opportunities that we have to take advantage of because no one knows what tomorrow will bring, what changes will take place. But there are, at this moment, unique opportunities.
Malcolm, it's always wonderful to speak to you. You keep doing the fabulous work. I keep saying you got to come into the studio and sit with me, maybe even take some phone calls. And I appreciate you enormously. Keep up the good work, and I'll chase you all the time.
Thank you. It's a lot closer to come to New Jersey than to Hong Kong, so I'm ready to make the trip.
Thank you very much, Malcolm.
Thank you.
The thoughts of Malcolm Hoenlein, Executive Vice Chairman of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations. And again, as I said, I feel bad it was an Israeli kid. Had to be an Israeli kid, a Jewish kid with dual citizenship. At the same time, I'm so pleased that, in fact, there is no movement within a white supremacist group here in America to target and bomb Jewish centers. My thanks, as always, to our director, Sloan Copeland, JBS's Associate Director, Dara Golub, editors Dennis Golan and John McDevitt, and to the producer of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.